To understand American imperialism, we have to go back to the 1800s. Even though the US was born out of a fight against British imperialism, the seeds of its own empire were sown shortly after independence. John Quincy Adams, one of America's early diplomats and a future president, famously advocated for American expansion. He described it as expanding the boundaries of freedom, yet it was often at the expense of indigenous peoples and neighboring nations. The first major wave of US imperialism came through the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand across the North American continent. By the mid-1800s, presidents like James K. Polk aggressively pursued this goal, leading to events like the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the US acquiring large territories, including California and Texas. But American imperialism wasn't just about expanding westward. It soon stretched beyond the mainland, into the Caribbean, the Pacific, and beyond. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a turning point. President William McKinley, spurred by nationalist sentiment and calls to protect US economic interests, launched the war under the guise of freeing Cuba from Spanish rule. Yet the US didn't stop at liberating Cuba. Instead, it took control of former Spanish colonies like Puerto Rico, Guam, and most controversially, the Philippines. What began as a war for Cuban freedom soon turned into a chapter of American domination. The Philippines fought back in what became a brutal and bloody conflict, with thousands of Filipino deaths. President Theodore Roosevelt is often seen as the face of American imperialism. A hero of the Spanish-American War, he believed in the expansion of American influence, what he called carrying a big stick. One of his most famous acts of imperialism was the construction of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt supported a revolution in Panama to break away from Colombia, allowing the US to secure control over the Canal Zone, a critical trade route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. While Roosevelt used military might, President Woodrow Wilson expanded US imperialism under the banner of spreading democracy. Wilson intervened in Latin America several times, sending troops to places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico. In each case, the US justified its actions by claiming to stabilize the region, but in reality, it was often about protecting American interests. By the early 20th century, the US had territories stretching from Puerto Rico in the Atlantic to the Philippines in the Pacific. Hawaii was annexed in 1898, and Alaska had already been purchased from Russia. These lands, while part of the US today, were initially acquired as part of a larger imperial strategy. Of course, not everyone was on board with American imperialism. Figures like Mark Twain and groups like the Anti-Imperialist League argued that this new empire contradicted America's values of freedom and self-determination. They believed that forcing American control over other nations was a betrayal of the country's founding principles. Today, American imperialism is often overlooked, but its effects are still felt. Puerto Rico remains a US territory without full rights, and other territories like Guam have limited representation in the government that controls them. The US may not call itself an empire, but the legacy of imperialism lingers. Presidents like McKinley, Roosevelt, and Wilson played key roles in expanding American power, shaping not just the nation's history, but the world as well. As we look back, it's important to recognize both the achievements and the darker sides of American history. Understanding imperialism isn't just about knowing the past. It's about recognizing how power and influence shape our present and future. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check us out, QuestClever.com, where we have more like it with worksheets and educational videos for you to learn.